to see so many of you, and how grateful we are to the Adult Education Committee, which is ably chaired by Dr. Katie Carlson-Eastbald, and who has brought us her former colleague and dear friend. Chad officiated at the marriage of Jonathan and Katie. And as we've all experienced from his meditation and worship this morning, we have a treat ahead of us. So Katie will now introduce Chad to us.
When asked for ideas of who to bring to Bay Weekend, Chad Schrock immediately came to mind. I'm delighted to introduce you to him today. Chad is Associate Professor of English at Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee, and Secretary of the Conference on Christianity and Literature. His academic interests, the relationship between the Bible and English literature, especially 1350 to 1650, has produced a book called Consolation in Medieval Narrative, and numerous articles on topics ranging from Beowulf to C.S. Lewis and 21st century mysteries and science fiction. He is a graduate of Pensacola Christian College, Eastern Mennonite Seminary, James Madison University, and the Pennsylvania State University. That's where he got his PhD. He and his wife of 22 years, Rachel, have 2 children. Toby is 12, and Lucy will turn 6 the Tuesday after our Bay Weekend. So those are the facts about Chad. However, few of them get all the way to the heart of who he is. Chad was on the search committee that hired me to teach English at Lee University. I remember sitting at a coffee shop over Christmas break, giddy about my new job. An email dropped into my inbox. It was from Chad, and he was inviting me to correspond with him so that when I arrived to teach the next summer, I would already have a friend. Our lunch group with several other professors was the finest example of collegiality I've ever known, and I will always count it among my life's highlights. In 2017, Chad was one of the first people I told about this new fellow in my life, Jonathan Eastbald. Chad, Rachel, and I were able to squeeze a trip into England with students just 2 weeks before Chad officiated at Jonathan's and my wedding, and we visited C.S. Lewis's house there. We got married just a mile away from here in Washington Park, and Chad officiated. And I should add that we are not the only couple present today for whom Chad officiated a wedding. I won't call them out, but one of the groups among us, the students here, Chad married them as well in the middle of the COVID pandemic. When marriage drew me away from Tennessee, Chad continued to correspond with me, as he does with a host of other former students, some of whom are with us today. A wise and dedicated friend with a quick wit, a ready laugh, a deep faith, and a well-read and widely ranging mind are just some of the traits that make Chad the person on earth who reminds me most of C.S. Lewis. It is most fitting that he chose to talk to us about C.S. Lewis today. Chad, welcome to Westminster.
Thanks, Katie. So, back, how are we now? All right, thank you. Okay. I was about to thank your pastors, Blythe and Christian, for being such gracious hosts, and now I get to thank them again. Thanks, Katie, for that really nice intro. I remember those emails. Should have done that. Okay. Okay. Christian is taking care of me. Is he taking care of you? Are we good? Okay. About 10 years ago, I taught a college freshman English writing class in which students had to give a presentation on some movie, TV show, or book that was science fiction, fantasy, something imaginary like that. And I did that over a number of years and noticed a very strong pattern. The imaginary worlds they chose to present were by and large dystopian. Dystopian, about a bad place, a harsh universe or political or cultural system, a place that isn't kind to its people. My college freshmen seem to have been trained to think that imagination is given to them to go into dark places. Every once in a while I'd get a Disney princess, Frozen maybe, but more often, the Hunger Games, set in the United States after some dreadful catastrophe in which the 12 districts, more or less poverty-stricken, serve a tyrannical capital in the Rocky Mountains, which I learned from Wikipedia while doing this research, and send representatives from their young people to fight to the death on a reality TV show. Or Divergent, The Maze Runner, The Matrix, The Book of Eli, zombie apocalypses like The Walking Dead, A Quiet Place 1 and 2, Wall-E, The Man in the High Castle, Sweet Tooth. Most of those are straight up post-apocalyptic, post-nuclear, post-epidemic, or post-evil power takes over the world. But even Game of Thrones is set in an ostentatiously savage world. I'm missing some. We haven't even gotten started on computer games. Mad Max, The Last of Us. Here we go. The Giver is a particularly chilling example. A book, and then a movie, which I have not seen, that starts out like a utopia, a society that works really well. But gradually you realize that no, underneath the surface, goodness, there's nothing but horror. Or The Handmaid's Tale, in which you realize that a society designed to be some people's utopia, say religious men's, is actually other people's dystopia, they're serving women's. Well, why is there so much dystopia? And why is it marketed to young people who have so much of their lives before them? There are a lot of possibilities, I guess, but the relevant ones I'll talk about today are conflict and relatability. It's hard to tell a story without conflict. The Bible doesn't tell much of a story about conflict. There's not a lot of narrative about Eden or the New Jerusalem. The Bible takes place between those two. Will there be stories in heaven, I wonder? Christians as mature as St. Augustine weren't sure. The conflict that drives stories is what happens when something goes wrong. Relatability. Most of us live in a world more like a dystopia than a utopia. The book that created the genre of utopia, Thomas More's Utopia, way back in the 1500s, made a strategic Greek pun in its title. Topia, place. The Greek prefix "eu" meant good, so utopia is a good place. But "u" is a negative particle, so utopia is also no place. A good place. A no place. Because nowhere in the world is there a perfectly good place. And when Moore was imagining a perfectly good place, he could only be writing fantasy. A place that existed in his imagination. We live in a fallen world. We tell stories about conflict in a fallen world. It would be hard to tell stories about a good world, a good place. And even if we were able to succeed, it's doubtful that they would be interesting or relatable. At best, we could produce something like The Giver, in which a utopia got peeled back to show its nasty underbelly, or The Handmaid's Tale, in which one person's or one social group's utopia is another group's dystopia. Most creative writers say that it's easier to make bad characters interesting and relatable than good characters. Solzhenitsyn reported from his life in a Soviet prison camp that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. Most of us aren't all good, aren't all bad. We live in that tension and we live it out in our lives and our choices and feel like we've failed. We relate to flawed, stumbling characters who are unsuccessful. Also, sometimes we just root for the bad guys. They tug at a part of our heart that we want to keep secret and let loose at the same time. Have you ever seen a story with some version of the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other that didn't have the devil coming off looking better than the angel? I give you... Oh, I don't know what that is. Here we go. This is from The Emperor's New Groove. He's telling us the devil is explaining that he's going to lead Schrock down the path that rocks. Here's another one. Here the angel, the devil is standing on his head. Look what I can do. The Schrock's like, what does that have to do with anything? And the angel's like, no, he's got a point. Even the angel is admitting that the devil's cooler when even the Schrock seems to disagree. There's a widely accepted term for a bland, uninterestingly good character. A Mary Sue. Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, Superman, and Luke Skywalker have all been accused of being Mary Sues. So good, they're boring. The most famous example, let me see. Aha. Do this. Now it's time. There we go. Of literary evil being more interesting than literary good is William Blake's snide comment about Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost tells the story of the fall of Adam and Eve in Eden, but it starts off with Satan giving some pretty spectacular speeches in hell, and God the Father and God the Son carrying on a pretty spectacularly boring conversation in heaven. I'm a Christian, and I'm bored by God the Father in Paradise Lost, Book 3. I don't like to teach it, I like to skip it. So William Blake. The reason Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when he wrote of devils and hell, is because he was a true poet, and of the devil's party without knowing it. A true poet is of the devil's party, says Blake. Milton was a true poet. He tried to work against his true poet self and tried to make God in truth look good. But that's not how the imagination works, and the attempt put Milton's imagination in fetters. It limited it drastically. Evil's more compelling, more magnetic. Which brings us to the Christian imagination, particularly C.S. Lewis's. Lewis inherits a centuries-old Western ambivalence about the imagination. In a psychological model that I think derived ultimately from Aristotle, the Middle Ages thought of our faculty psychology, our epistemology, our way of knowing as involving three stages that have to do, there's our friend again, with three parts of the brain. We take in knowledge through our senses, especially our eyes. They went on and on about the eyes. Love at first sight is one of their ideas. Cupid's arrow strikes you in the eye before it goes down into your heart. And these sensory knowledge data imprint into your brain physically like wax, like a photographic plate or Polaroid, some of you remember this. They get stored, they get shelved in the filing system of your brain. Something will trigger that memory, and then before you know it, the image is back out in all its glory. And maybe the smell, and maybe the sound too. Your brain is physically different. It's materially different because of what you've seen. It's made a mark on you. And then in our time, of course, Inside Out gives us a kind of visual depiction of this sort of memory library or house. It's actually, those are memories there. The other day I was talking to a student, and I asked her if she was at such and such event a couple years ago, and she told me the very words I used to tease her. It was that they had imprinted in her brain. I didn't know if she was there, but for her, it was as if it had happened yesterday. It was right there on the top shelf. One thing that's just kind of super sweet is that they believe if you fell in love with someone, that person's image got imprinted physically on your heart. Kind of like a heart tattoo. The second stage and part of the brain is the imagination, and that's where these images are combined. You've got this library of photographic plates of wax imprints. You need some way to manipulate them and put them into relationship, and the imagination does that. Here we go. We have to move on quickly to the third stage, reason, because in the old days, in the tradition that Lewis inherits from the Middle Ages and just gets hammered down even more solidly in the Enlightenment and modern science and the industrial age, reason is more important than the imagination. Reason needs to boss imagination. You can't just combine these images willy-nilly. You've got to control them. You've got to systematize them. I'm looking out at this room. You're a panorama. My mind is taking snapshots and sending these images to my brain. And so I'm thinking, this group goes, if I'm going left to right, this group goes after this group and before this group. If I combine them differently, I have an unreasonable picture of this room. An imagination uncontrolled by reason can create monsters. Here's a griffin, half lion, back half, in case you're curious, front half eagle. That's just somebody's imagination sort of slammed those two together. There's a unicorn. That's just regular, I don't know what that is, like a unicorn deer or something, or a small cow. But it's got a narwhal horn or an antelope horn just stuck on its head. Here are human hybrids. I thought about this a lot. This is how you make monsters. A manticore is on the left. It's a lion body, human face, if you're lucky, scorpion tail. And the one on the right is a centaur. Now, my sources told me that that is a horse. But I'm having trouble. I know that the centaur is half horse, half person, but that, I don't know what that is. Mermaids are also good examples of this. Women fish, but maybe that's not an image that we need in a church setting. Although I did just read a pretty good novel about mermaids in 1500s. It was fiction. It was fiction. The Middle Ages imagined monsters and the monstrous, and they also thought that the time for when most of us, our imagination operates without conscious rational control is in dreams. I'm not up on the latest psychology, but I know that Freud and Jung thought so too. Dreams are really interesting places where your mind combines things that are not rationally combinable. People from your work life, meet people from your church life, meet your Uncle Bill. A familiar setting of home can morph into a castle you visited once, can morph into the Grand Canyon. Dream experience is trippy, it's surreal because it combines that which should not be combined. So, I like to tell my students this one. This is literally a dream I had when I was 10 years old. I was with some weasels. And I don't think I was a weasel, but I was with them. And we were politically active, Weasel Alliance. We were rebelling against King Saul. And we were more politically active than we were economically active. We needed funds for our rebellion. So we had a costume shop that we ran to fund our rebellion against King Saul. So weasels, you can see what's happening in my 10-year-old brain. Like these things that don't go together, somehow came together. And they came together kind of smashingly in this narrative like climax where Saul walked into our costume shop. And we're like, oh, what's going on? And I think everything was so excited that I woke up at that point. I think. This is just new. The other day, a class and I were looking at Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and this is a famously mixed metaphor. The heart that spanieled me at heel. So you have hearts that are spanieling, that's a verb. To whom I gave their wishes do discandy. So you got the spanieling hearts discandying, melt their sweets on blossoming Caesar. So Caesar's over here blossoming somehow. So you've got hearts spanieling, discandy, blossoming Caesar, and this pine is bark that overtopped them all. And so I told the class, I was like, anybody in here want to like draw this? And a student did. Look, you can see the spaniel there on the tree. The heart that's discandying, dripping down, melting its sweets onto Caesar, who's got little petals in his head. And then there's the pine tree beside it. That's like, she was trying to rationally contain something. I mean, it still doesn't make sense, but it makes more sense now that she sort of tackled it. with her reason and put it all in one scene. All right. There's no message there. There's no message in my dream. It wasn't real. I mean, I could psychoanalyze it, but it's just imagination. If we took those irrational combinings as real, we'd get ourselves into real trouble. And maybe you've dreamed something and woken up and thought it was real, or not been sure whether memory was real or a dream, and weren't sure how much weight to put on it. That's an important question. Another word for imagination, an almost exact synonym, is fantasy. And here are some definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary of the word fantasy. And in these definitions, we see strong ambivalence. You need fantasy or imagination. Everybody needs it, but it can turn weird and even toxic if it's not governed by reason, if you're not careful. So, scholastic psychology, mental apprehension of an object of perception, the faculty by which this was performed, that's 1400, 1669 is when that definition was in operation. The image impressed on the mind by an object of sense. But here, a spectral apparition, phantom, an illusory appearance. It's not real. Delusive imagination, hallucination, the fact or habit of deluding oneself by imaginary perceptions or reminiscences. The very same years between 1300 and 1700, fantasy can mean these images and how they're processed by the mind, but it can also mean something phantom, illusory, delusive. It's something you have to be careful with. It's a necessary part of how we as humans know the truth, but it's the most unreliable part of how we know the truth. It can make monsters. Lewis's tutor, when he was a teenager, W.H. Patrick, gave Lewis a ruthless training in the exercise of reason. So this is Lewis in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, describing his tutor. If ever a man came near to being a purely logical entity, that man was Kirk. The most casual remark was taken as a summons to disputation. Refutation, when we got so far, always followed the same lines. Had I read this? Had I studied that? Had I any statistical evidence? Had I any evidence in my own experience? And so, to the almost inevitable conclusion, do you not see then that you had no right to say whatever? Some boys would not have liked it. To me, it was red beef and strong beer. And that for Lewis is a positive. By all the accounts I've read, Lewis absolutely flourished under this logical teacherly regime. He took to it like a merman to water. He loved that logic, the cut and thrust and parry of the mind. He grew up to write patient, logical expositions of mere Christianity and the problem of pain and miracles, and to head up a Christian apologetics organization called the Socratic Club. And yet, what haunted Lewis throughout his life, what got at his heart most reliably, was imagination. Stabs of feeling, not logic. What he called joy in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. He would be reading some work of imagination or myth when a thrill would shoot out of it. It came on him first in early childhood through, among other avenues, Beatrix Potter, Squirrel Nutkin. And here is how he describes it. It's an unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed only one characteristic in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, it might almost equally be well be called a particular kind of unhappiness or grief. But then it's a kind we want. I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. The central story of my life is about nothing else, he says. This longing for something we cannot have in this world. Longing for something greater than this world. A longing that no worldly image can fully awaken in us, but can partially awaken, as if telling us of something greater than itself. This longing led Lewis step by step to faith in Jesus. It was his spiritual way of knowing, his spiritual epistemological faculty. Early in his adulthood, he dismissed the longing as worthless, utterly unhelpful for actually knowing stuff worth knowing. It was imaginary, obviously. It was a longing for something that didn't exist, but he couldn't escape it. And in the end, he converted to Christianity in part because of a conversation in which Tolkien convinced him that myths were not just lies breathed through silver, lies more attractive and interesting than the truth, but actually the way to deeper spiritual truth. By showing us truth deeper than our senses and deeper than our reason, the imagination points us to that which transcends what's around us and what's in us. It points us to God. What changed Lewis's life was the belief that his imagination pointed to what's really real. Jesus the Christ is where reason and imagination link hands, where myth becomes fact. It's the title of one of his essays. Good is more interesting than evil in Lewis's imagination. The book that made him famous, Screwtape Letters, that is actually, he was a cover story in Time. In 1947, there's the devil there on his left, Screwtape. The book that made him famous, Screwtape Letters, features a narrator who's a demon, Screwtape. Lewis wrote him as pleasure-killing as possible. Even Screwtape's voice is dull and drab. God is more interesting and compelling than the devil. Lewis takes a whole chapter in his book, A Preface to Paradise Lost, chapter 13, on Satan, to argue against Blake's claim that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. And what he says goes to the heart of the fallen imagination. Satan, actually Blake's right, Satan is the best drawn of Milton's characters. In all but a few writers, the good characters are the least successful, and everyone who's ever tried to make, even the humblest story ought to know why. To make a character worse than oneself, it's only necessary to release imaginatively from control some of the bad passions which in real life are always straining at the leash. The Satan, the Iago, the Becky Sharp within each of us is always there, and only too ready to come out and have in our books that holiday we try to deny them in our lives. We do not really know what it feels like to be a man much better than ourselves. This whole inner landscape is one we have never seen, and when we guess it, we blunder. Heaven understands hell, and hell does not understand heaven. Our imagination does naturally lead us toward evil, but a Christian, writing with the help of the Holy Spirit, might try to swim against the current of human fallenness, and not successfully, because that would be impossible, but less unsuccessfully. Christian fantasy is high, it's transcendent, it's a vision of the good, so great that it's irrational. It transcends the capacity of this world. That transcendent good, who is God, would take the part of us that lies to understand God. So contrary to fact is God. So Lewis starts using his imagination to write Christian fantasy. He tries his hand at paradise. Now, only two Christian writers have done a remotely passable job at describing paradise: Dante and Milton. Not even the Bible really tries it. Maybe that should warn us. Dante did it better in the early 1300s. He's the best Christian writer ever, and he knew it. He's a little obnoxiously smug about it. He wrote a trilogy about hell, purgatory, and heaven. So he spent a lot of time on heaven, and just in general did as reasonably good a job of exploring what heaven might be like as you could ask for. Although I personally disagree with pretty much all of it, but it was good. It makes sense. But most secular readers, and even some Christian readers, find Dante's hell more interesting than his heaven. And the anthology I teach out of, the Norton Anthology, which is kind of standard for all college classrooms, includes all of Dante's Inferno, but only 1/33 of Dante's Paradiso. It assumes that college sophomores will be 33 times more interested and edified by Dante's hell than by his heaven. And Milton also struggled, as we've seen. Not even Dante wrote about God directly as a character. Milton did, and that was kind of, says and does just the right thing. He makes you feel as though he's in control, as though God's in control. But every once in a while, the writers will make Mr. Whitaker say something I don't agree with, and it hurts. Like I disagree with God. Like God is letting me down. There's a lot at stake in writing about God and perfection. If you get it wrong, you tell people something's true when it isn't. Something is God or God's word when it isn't. I've been reading a book by a Christian author, H.S. Cross, and there's a character in there who I think is Jesus, maybe, and he doesn't show up much, and when he does, he doesn't talk much. And there's another character who's Jesus if that first character isn't. And that other character we never even see. The main character just feels the weight of his arm. H.S. Cross gets it. She knows her limitations. She knows how far her imagination can get her toward portraying God, and when she should quit while she's ahead, or at least not too far behind. Lewis, as far as I know, is the first significant Christian author since Milton in the 1660s to try giving a description of paradise. He believes in the power of the Christian imagination to give us access to spiritual truth. He's going to try. Go, Lewis, go. Bless his heart, we would say in the South. And the result is this wild novel, Perelandra. Here's the book. It's a doozy. The plot goes something like this. Main character, Elwyn Ransom, is a language teacher, a philologist. Some people think he was modeled on Lewis's friend Tolkien. In the previous book, Out of the Silent Planet, Ransom got shanghaied onto a spaceship that went to Mars. But now an angel has come to Ransom's home back on Earth and takes him to Venus instead. Venus is a world that only has two human figures on it. They're Adam and Eve, basically, because Venus is unfallen. It's a Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, they're perfect, sinless. There it is. So Lewis, like John Milton, his predecessor, is describing the Garden of Eden and has a lot of fun imagining what it would be like to inhabit an unfallen setting. What the animals might behave like. Clue, a dragon behaves a lot like a dog, and fish will let you ride on their backs. What the food might be like. Awesome. What the scenery might be like. Floating islands. So Ransom goes exploring this beautiful new place and meets Eve, who's a lady, except that she's entirely green. They talk a bit. Ransom finds out that the green couple can eat from any tree they please, but they have to sleep on the floating islands. God doesn't allow them to sleep on the fixed land. That's the one island that's made entirely of earth and doesn't move. The green lady doesn't know why they can't sleep on the fixed land. There's an absolute prohibition. So Ransom and the green lady hang out, get acquainted. Ransom's former kidnapper, the scientist Weston, lands on Venus with an actual spaceship and becomes possessed by the devil, as one does. So, Eve, green lady, check. Paradise, Venus, check. Prohibition, fixed land, check. And tempter, Weston, check. Just all this stuff is coming together. But you're kind of bummed, because the green lady's nice, and this world is really pretty. And it would be a shame to spoil it with a fall and death and so on. So you're starting to care about this. And Ransom is here, kind of extra, not really part of the Bible story. So where does he fit in? He knows the Bible story, and he's curious about that himself. Weston / the devil starts tempting the green lady. They have lots of long theological discussions. Ransom joins in. Green lady stays strong, but she gradually weakens over the course of a few weeks. And so God tells Ransom to end the temptation by killing Weston. Lewis also wrote an essay called Why I'm Not a Pacifist, which is relevant here. Ransom attacks Weston in kind of comically vicious hand-to-hand combat and ends up killing him. It takes a good long while in several stages. Finally, Ransom heals, celebrates with the green lady and her green husband, who finally shows up and then returns to Earth. So that's the story. Happy ending, fall averted. Paradise Not Lost But Saved. Take that, John Milton. Is it a good book? We had some fun discussions about this last night. Am I recommending it? Well, it depends. Depends on what you like. Sometimes Lewis's rational brain takes over from his imaginative one, especially in the theological discussions, which are maybe more ideas and less story. So unless the ideas fire you up, they can get a bit dull. Sometimes his fiction can get not preachy, but talky. And then his imagination is kind of erratically engaged. On the one hand, he thinks through certain aspects of the world of Venus beautifully. Floating islands are amazing. Here's some fan art. It's a little more ransom than we needed to see. But you can see the floating islands. I mean, that's cool. That's just cool. And he learns how to walk on them. It's just really neat. It's hard to walk on land that takes the changing shape of water underneath. So he'll stand up. He'll feel like he's walking through a valley, and then all of a sudden he'll be on a mountaintop because a wave has come through, and then everything will be perfectly flat in the space of just a few steps. So Lewis has thought through the sky, which is pale, a pure flat gold, like the background of a medieval picture. So this is a pretty good rendition. But sometimes Lewis doesn't work very hard to hide the imaginative scenes. A lot of the animals are really just almost like the animals we saw, the medieval animals, just like two earth animals spliced together. The Dachshunds of the pig world. A long-legged bird like a very small stork, singing rather like a canary. What would we get if we crossed a canary and a stork? A cork, a stenary. A furred animal, something like a wallaby, but yellow. Let's take a wallaby and make it, I don't know, purple? No, yellow. Let's go with this. He doesn't seem to be working very hard. White beasts with black spots about the size of sheep, but with ears so much larger, noses so much more mobile, tails so much longer that the general impression was rather of enormous mice. So, Dalmatian sheep mice. As an author of a series that has very often been marketed as science fiction, Lewis really doesn't care about science. You want to know Lewis's principle of space travel? You ready for it? Ransom travels to Venus by climbing into a box that an angel moves to Venus. That's it. That's how you travel through space. Find the right box and befriend the right angel. Lewis was a notoriously quick writer. There's actually scholarly debate about whether he edited his work after writing his first draft. I remember reading some scholar who said, Lewis actually crossed out some stuff here and wrote some stuff beside it. See, he revised, see? That was sort of the premise of an article. And in the middle of all of this Eden on Venus and Green Lady Eving, God shows up. God shows up in a passage so strange that I wanted to write about it for years. And when I got this invitation, I took the chance. God shows up in relationship with ransom, like God with Adam and Eve in the garden. This is what Lewis imagines a perfect relationship with God to be. And here's where we're going to part for the rest of the time. That sense of being in someone's presence, which had descended upon him with such unbearable pressure during the very first moments of his conversation with the lady, did not disappear when he had left her. It was, if anything, increased. Her society had been, in some degree, a protection against it, and her absence left him not to solitude, but to a more formidable kind of privacy. At first, it was almost intolerable, as he put it to us in telling the story. There seemed no room. But later on, he discovered that it was intolerable only at certain moments, at just those moments, in fact, symbolized by his impulse to smoke and to put his hands in his pockets, when a man asserts his independence and feels that now, at last, he's on his own. When you felt like that, then the very air seemed too crowded to breathe. A complete fullness seems to be excluding you from a place which, Nevertheless, you were unable to leave. But when you gave in to the thing, gave yourself up to it, there was no burden to be borne. It became not a load, but a medium, a sort of splendor as of eatable, drinkable, breathable gold, which fed and carried you, and not only poured into you, but out from you as well. Taken the wrong way, it suffocated. Taken the right way, it made terrestrial life seem, by comparison, a vacuum. At first, of course, the wrong moments occurred pretty often, but like a man who has a wound that hurts him in certain positions and who gradually learns to avoid those positions, Ransom learned not to make that inner gesture. That's it. That's the big payoff. That's Lewis on what it would be like to have an unfallen relationship with God. And I find it strange. Well, first, not what we would have expected. We might have expected Lewis to stick more closely to how the Bible talks about unmediated relationship with God. We walk with God. That's the Genesis version. Genesis 3:8. They heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. In that description, it sounds like God has a body. He's making noises. Rustle, rustle. He's someone you could walk with, walk naked with, unashamed and unafraid, until you had sinned. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The guy who had perhaps the closest Old Testament relationship with God, so close God had him skip death, got to walk with God. 17 verses later, Noah walked with God. That's how he got out of the flood free. David doesn't get to walk with God, but in several verses he walks before God and in God's ways. Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? Walking with God, there's a mutuality, a levelness. God is meeting me at my level. God's over there and I'm over here. There are clear boundaries between us, but we're going parallel on the same plane together. Lewis's version is the very opposite. Ransom feels the pressure of God most clearly when there are clearest boundaries between himself and God. When he most sharply individuates, when he's a self by himself. We might say when he's found his true self. He's not with anyone else. He doesn't have to perform, to pretend to like his niece's piano playing or his brother-in-law's cooking. He's free from social constructs of race, class, and gender. He's stripped down to his essentials. And at that moment, when he's finally got the room he's always wanted, there's no room. Finally, the he is, he's crowded out intolerably and suffocated. God is either, let's see here. God is either a load or a medium, like a yoke or like air. Ransom doesn't have a relationship with God unless we could say that we have a relationship with air. He participates in God. He's in God like a raisin in a fruitcake or peanut butter in a sandwich. Ransom and God aren't two of the same kind of thing, which is what we usually think of needing for a relationship. God is something different, something other, something strange, and most of all, something heavy. I can think of two ways to explain God as weight in Lewis's novel. One I know he knew about, and one I know he knew and talked about. So we'll start with the one he just knew about. Before the apple fell on Sir Isaac Newton's head, or whatever, people knew there was gravity. It wasn't like it took an apple to fall on Newton's head for them to figure that one out. But they also knew that the tendency of solid stuff to fall didn't explain some other natural phenomenon. Like, for instance, when you sit around a campfire. Gravity has little to do with the mechanics of what fire does. Smoke doesn't clunk to the ground like a brick. A flame doesn't fly out from the ground and then down like a lunging snake. You could just as easily, you could more easily say that fire wants to go upward. Fires burn up before they ever burn down. They burn down when they stop being fire. Air too. You ever see air fall? Well, you've never seen air. But have you ever seen evidence that air falls? Do smells crawl along the ground, or do they go out into the air in all directions? If you're flying a kite and your kite goes crashing down on currents of air, that's a bad day. Kites naturally go up if they're rising on air currents. Smart birds who ride air currents drift and soar. So Aristotle thought, yeah, everything has weight, and weight takes everything where it belongs. That's what weight does. It takes you somewhere. Something isn't in the right place, and weight is the intrinsic property of the thing that will move you to where you belong. So earth and water belong downward. That's why it doesn't rain into the sky, and water rivers don't flow uphill. But fire and air belong upward, and their weight, their airy gravity, if you want to call it that, takes them up where they belong. So since earth, water, fire, and air are the four elements of which everything is made, according to Aristotle, that about wraps up physics. Weight puts you where you belong. You pick up 5 pounds over the Christmas holidays, that just means you belong a little farther in your easy chair. Augustine comes along, 397, and spiritualizes Aristotelian physics. A physical object tends by its weight to find its natural level. It doesn't tend necessarily downward, but toward whatever its natural level is. Fire tends up as a stone tends down. Their weight keeps them in motion until they find their own level. Oil poured out under water comes to the surface. Water poured out over oil sinks below it. Their weight keeps them in motion until they find their level. Out of their proper place, they're unstable. In their proper place, they are stabilized. The weight moving me is love. The weight moving me is love. Love is the gravity of my spirit. I'm drawn physically, emotionally, spiritually toward what I love. That motion, we might call momentum or force. Augustine is calling weight. And he's saying what really forces us to move in life is love. Why do you make the decisions you make? Love, desire, longing for something you lack, something you want, something you think you need. There's no story without love because there's no story without movement. And what gets people to move is love. Love takes you to where you belong because you belong with whom and with what you love. By your gift, Augustine says to God, we are kindled and borne upward. We are set afire and we go. We ascend the heart's ascents and sing the climbing song. It's your fire for good that burns in us as we go up toward our peace, which is Jerusalem. Since I take joy from those who told me we are going to the Lord's house. There your favor will give us our proper place, and we shall wish for nothing but to stay there eternally. We, you and me, are more like fire than earth, according to Augustine. We belong in heaven with God. Our true longing, our true belonging is for things of the Spirit. For Augustine, that's a gift. He thought for a long time that his true longings were for things of the earth, specifically sex and fame. He's so thankful that he belongs in heaven, that he burns not for women, but for heaven. There he is, citing Bible verses about the ascent to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was on a hill, and pilgrims had to climb to get there. And they would sing about climbing as they climbed. Those are the Psalms of Ascent. Augustine spiritualizes that climb. His soul is climbing like their bodies, climbing toward the Jerusalem that is to come, the paradise when his restless, weighted, freighted, wandering soul will finally find its rest in Jesus. In one of my favorite passages in all of literature, Dante tells us what it feels like to finally settle into where you belong. It gives me chills. It does. Dante, the narrator, has traveled through all hell, all purgatory, all heaven. He's at the tippy top of heaven. The human and angel-inhabited heaven, looking upward still where his human vision has no right to go, up to God, whom words cannot describe, nor mind even register. Dante says, I saw God, but there's no way God could imprint on my mind. I don't have any memory of what I saw. My mind couldn't hold it, but this is what I got instead. The last lines of Dante's great Divine Comedy. The truth I wished for came cleaving my mind in a great flash of light. Here my powers rest from their high fantasy. But already I could feel my being turned, instinct and intellect balanced equally, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. Dante's writing high fantasy. He's using his imagination as hard as he can to explain to us as much as he can about what it might be like to see God. He finally quits. He's exhausted his considerable powers of description. But here's the thing. At the end of 3 long poems and 14,233 lines of poetry, Dante's finally seen God. He doesn't understand that sight, but what it does is it clicks him into place in the universe. The love of God has made him belong. He knows where he belongs, and he is where he belongs. He's in perfect harmony with the universe and with the God of love who runs the universe. Henceforth there will be no more friction, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars. No weight will hold him down, will suffocate or pressure him intolerably. He can move freely because he moves in perfect harmony with the love who moves everything. C.S. Lewis knows his Augustine and his Dante. He knows that the weight that gets a soul moving is love. That's what he means by joy. That unfulfilled longing for something not of this world is there as a sign to lead us to God. A longing so sharp and painful because we know it can never be fulfilled. I listen to students talk about their hopes for significant others or friendship, and I think what you want from these people is not available. The world doesn't make that kind of satisfaction. It's not here. If you put the weight of that expectation on a spouse or parent or mentor or friend or child or pastor or career, you're going to be disappointed. It's bitter. But it's sweet because you know that what you want is sweet, is sweetness beyond belief. You know that you were made for that sweetness, and that fact is good news, even though you can't even imagine experiencing it enough to be satisfied. Not really. Maybe you can taste it now and then in a stab of joy that hurts so much because of how incomplete it is. The German romantic thinker Novalis symbolized this longing with a blue flower. His hero, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, whose name is really fun to say, so I'll say it again, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, had a dream of a blue flower that haunted him and made him go look for it, and that search for the blue flower constitutes the novel and Ofterdingen's story on Earth. Lewis, when he was a very little child, looked out his nursery windows at some hills. They were not very far off, but they were to children quite unattainable. They taught me longing, sensucht, made me, for good or ill, and before I was 6 years old, a votary of the blue flower. That's the blue flower he means, it's Novalis. And I say that in part to say, this group, Grey Havens, writes a lot of lyrics based on C.S. Lewis, and they just put out an album called Blue Flower. And this is one of their songs, and I won't read the whole thing, and we're not going to listen to it, but you can just see blue flowers, dreaming of paradise, find home, catch that dream, where I belong. That's Lewis all the way through. And Lewis's ransom in Venus Eden feels a weight when he gets out of whack. That weight is an Aristotelian weight, a weight of you're not where you belong. You're not fitting frictionless into the motion of the universe. It's a Dantean weight. You're not moving as a wheel whose motion nothing jars. You're lurching like a wheel that keeps going over the pothole of your self-centeredness. Gravity hurts, but once Ransom relaxes, once he stops fighting, once he stops asserting his own right to privacy and just yields to the love that moves the sun and the other stars and is all around him, that love that's a medium of sort of splendor as of eatable, drinkable, breathable gold, which fed and carried you, not only poured into you, from out of you as well. Once that happens, once he learns how to yield to it, he's found where he belongs and he can move freely. More freely than he'd ever moved before. In perfect cooperation with a fullness in the universe that made terrestrial life seem a vacuum. Second, the weight that we know Lewis knew and also talked about. The Hebrew biblical version. The Hebrew word for glory, kavod, means originally weighty or heavy or significant. Lewis preached a very famous sermon called The Weight of Glory. And in it he took very seriously that we in the world, we need to take on the weightiness of God, that we are promised glorification in paradise because God's weighty glory will become our own. He defines glory as fame or good report from God, not just from our human peers. And then in a quick flurry of logic, he makes glory from God to us the blue flower, the unending experience of joy we've been getting stabs of our whole life. The sense that in this universe we're treated as strangers, the longing to be acknowledged, to meet with some response, to bridge some chasm that yawns between us and reality, is part of our inconsolable secret. And surely, from this point of view, the promise of glory, in the sense described, becomes highly relevant to our deep desire. For glory means good report with God, acceptance by God, response, acknowledgement, and welcome into the heart of things. The door on which we have been knocking all our lives will open at last. The weight of glory in this sermon is finally the weight of your glory to me and my glory to you. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way as the sacrament. For in him also Christ, the glorifier and glorified, glory himself, is truly hidden. Interactions with our fellow humans carry a weight, a solemnity, because however much we rejoice and be merry with them, these people are heavily glorious with a golden splendor after the image of their Creator God. As it happens, I myself have felt God's weight on my soul and on my body, like Elijah trying to resurrect me. The Christian life is two kinds of difficult, I think. And one kind of difficult is better than the other. You're either working against God or you're working with God. Ransom, in our passage, is working against God. That's why he feels the weight. There's nothing the matter. He talks about putting his hands in his pockets. There's nothing the matter with that. I wouldn't advise smoking, although Lewis knocked pipe ash into his carpets, believing that that did them good. He was wrong. But it's that clearing space for yourself apart from God that Ransom does without even knowing what he's doing that leads to trouble. He isn't on his own. He's immersed in God, the golden heavyweight God, inside and out. And that's not the time to do your own thing. I could tell you story after story about how this works, but I'll go with this one. I have been in the running for dream jobs twice. Leah's not one of them. Lovely, glad I was there, yay. But that's a different. I was in the running for the dream jobs twice. For the first, I had someone look at my CV and say, "You're perfect for this job." For the second, an alum of the school sent me the ad because I was the person she wanted to carry on the legacy of her alma mater. Both were Christian schools. They made sense for me. I made sense for them. How badly I wanted them. It was a fierce, salt desire, so hard it scared me. But as hard as I worked, for as logical a conclusion as I worked for, it felt like I was swimming upstream, swimming in sludge. I had decided that something should happen that wasn't supposed to happen. I could feel it in my soul. There was nothing wrong with what I was doing. There was nothing wrong with what I wanted. God's presence was just a load on me, not a medium in which I moved freely. Ichabod, I felt like. The glory has departed. I was trying to make something happen only in my own strength. That's a weird feeling, like a reverse Midas. Everything you touch, turning to dust, you can't work and get anywhere, nothing the matter with you. You're spinning your wheels really hard and fast like your hardworking parents and their Protestant work ethic taught you, but the wheels are just still spinning. They're not getting anywhere. It's like there's a God weight just holding you in place. Working with God isn't necessarily less strenuous than working against God. It isn't necessarily more pleasant. It's just freer. You can move. You can go somewhere. Your labor and strain has a purpose and direction. You're moving with the grain of the love that moves the sun and the other stars and fills the atmosphere with eatable, drinkable, breathable splendor. You're still running hard, but with the wind, not against the wind. There came a time when Ransom was despairing that the Green Lady was going to fall to Weston's temptations. And then God showed up in the utter darkness of a Paralandran night. The darkness was packed quite full. It seemed to press upon his trunk so that he could hardly use his lungs. It seemed to close in on his skull like a crown of intolerable weight so that for a space he could hardly think. Moreover, he became aware that in some indefinable fashion it had never been absent, that only some unconscious activity of his own had succeeded in ignoring it for the past few days. We know who this is. He knows who. And he's resisting this weight of God, of glory, unconsciously at first for days. He comes to feel the weight of God because he feels the weight of resisting God. The weight closes in on his chest like a panic attack. Closes in on his head like a crown of thorns because, that's going to ask him to do something really difficult and painful. Told you it wasn't necessarily easier this way. Thoughts start coming into Ransom's head about God's will for his life, about God's strategy for his trip to Venus, about fighting the devil in Weston's body in single combat. Ransom talked back to these thoughts. His voluble self talked back, Lewis calls it, his talky self. And the pressure stayed quiet. The terrible silence became more and more like a face not without sadness that looks upon you while you're telling lies and never interrupts, but gradually you know that it knows and falter and contradict yourself and lapse into silence. The voluble self petered out in the end. Almost the darkness said to Ransom, you know you're only wasting time. Darkness now has a capital D. The darkness becomes the voice, for it was almost with a voice that he was now contending. The voice started using words, crisp, short sentences. It's not for nothing that you're named Ransom. My name also is Ransom. More and more, the voice has become a person in a relationship with Ransom, a partnership. More and more defined to Ransom as the journey to the cross itself becomes more defined. And then, gradually something happened to him which had happened to him only twice before in his life. It had happened once while he was trying to make up his mind to do a very dangerous job in the last war. It had happened again while he was screwing his resolution to go and see a certain man in London and make to him an excessively embarrassing confession, which justice demanded. In both cases, the thing had seemed a sheer impossibility. He had not thought but known that being what he was psychologically incapable of it, and then, without any apparent movement of the will, as objective and unemotional as the reading on a dial, there had arisen before him with perfect certitude the knowledge, about this time tomorrow, you will have done the impossible. He now knew, almost as a historical proposition, that it was going to be done. He was going to move in harmony with the breathable gold that fed and carried and poured into him and out of him. He had stopped talking back to the darkness, the voice, and it was going to carry him. And he was going to do the impossible that he could not have imagined for himself, much less done by himself. It was going to hurt a lot. Essentially, he was going to fight Weston the devil to the death, punching and biting like a UFC fight gone very bad between two English professors. Nobody wants to see that. He was going to take a wound to the heel that would bleed the rest of his life, but he was going to do it. Defeat Weston and the devil. Weston fought with tooth and claw. Ransom was the boxer. He was moving with the weight of glory, like a pile driver that could be battered and bruised but couldn't be stopped. So this is what Lewis has in mind for a utopian relationship between God and you. This is his best possible scenario. A God in whom you live and move and have your being. A God who transfers the divine glory to you, who makes you share the name of ransom. A God who hems you in behind and before and constricts your movement even when you're not on speaking terms. It's hard to kick against the goad. A God whom you come to feel when you resist the divine pressure and whom you come to know personally from silence to darkness to a voice when God leads you into suffering. A God who, when you move freely in the divine will, can lead you down an irrational path into doing the impossible and the unimaginable. The deepest truths of the Spirit are only accessible where the imagination meets the reason and leads the reason. This composite image of our relationship with God is hard to believe because it is true.